Today we talk briefly, because of the importance of the topic that requires definitely more than one introductory video, to say the least, of the Finnish-Soviet War of 1939-1940. One of the most famous chapters in the broader context of the Second World War altogether, that in fact would require much greater digression to explain properly the background, not just of Finland and the Soviet Union, but Scandinavia and the relations with Nazi Germany, with the Western Allies, and so on. So this war started in November 1939, so essentially just a couple of months after the Nazi and Soviet invasion of Poland, and the contendants essentially being part, in fact, of a greater game that, again, we have not the time to explain properly. In any case, speaking of the causes of the war, since summer 1939, the Soviet Union had become concerned with the growing power of Nazi Germany, which was even at that point. The Soviets were already actually on the alert for that, because actually the Soviet purposes, things are debated actually, but if you study the deployment of Soviet forces on the western border of the Union, you realize that quite likely they were disposed in an offensive fashion. That is to say, they of course, Hitler at that point was just anticipating what was in the air now from the general historical events of the previous years, and that point would have not been really would have been prudent, let's say, to understand in a broad. But this too is yet another story. So the Soviets were especially concerned about their own exposed positions of Leningrad and Murmansk had Hitler moved into Finland. Thus, the Soviets requested that Finland turn over land north of Leningrad and some land for a base on the Gulf of Finland. And in return, the Soviets would give essentially some rather worthless, forest land in eastern Karelia, and sign trade and defense treaties. Finland naturally rejected the proposal for many reasons. Finland had emerged as an independent country from 1917. It had fought, a civil war that, of course, was essentially about the same positions of the one of also the Russian Civil War. So essentially the attempt of a communist revolution, and thus her government, that had managed to triumph over the Bolsheviks, was unavoidably and rightfully strongly anti-communist, as it was worried, of course, of the Soviet purpose that was definitely the one, essentially, of taking over the country sooner or later. That was Stalin's plan, right? And his entire view was essentially to incorporate all, to take over Finland, to establish a puppet state, and claim what would be said at that point is complete victory. Things would go very differently from that, and the Soviet proposal to Finland was, of course, to be rejected, because first of all, it would seriously weaken her defense positions, given that these lands were fundamentally, arranged, as we will see now, from a long time in function of a defense from Soviet Russia. Also, it was a simple matter of liberty, of patriotism, national feeling, right? How can you ask a country to, take away their native land? So there was, in this sense, enough political and strategical need from both sides to go at war. At least, from the Soviet side, it was the offensive one. So negotiations failed, and what ensued was essentially Finland, so a 3 million people country, preparing to defend herself against 183 million Soviets. Right. And the war that would ensue essentially from November 1939 to March 1940 is one of, in fact, most famous wars in military, in the annals of the military history, chiefly for probably also the setting, the typical example of a hostile environment that managed to resist with extraordinary, almost unbelievable success, inflicting to invaders a literally unbelievable amount of losses, a disproportionate amount of losses. So the theater of operations is, of course, great part, right? It's a bit the protagonist of this war. War is not decided by terrain. War is decided by armies and moral forces and strategy and lots of other things that are blended together. But definitely the terrain, the climate does help a lot. So this war was fought, as you understand, November, March in Finland in a very harsh winter climate. In part, this, especially towards spring that came later that year, favored the Soviet last, push on Finland, because a bit like when the Mongols invaded Russia, it's better to do it when everything's frozen rather than in the season of, melting. And for the rest, the area is essentially, first of all, sparsely populated. Finland was largely an agrarian country, of course, at the time, heavily forested and swampy, right, with a very few, let's say, conventional targets fundamentally. And that would therefore dramatically influence the strategy and the performances in the war. So the Finnish terrain is essentially covered with old igneous rock scored into rolling hills by glaciation, while the low areas are filled with lakes and swamps. So a terrifying ground. And also, in fact, this is all covered in forest, heavily at least, and providing thus a great deal of cover and concealment, especially for the type of forces that in fact the Finnish had been preparing in the wake of in the expectation of a Soviet offensive. A bit different is Lapland in the north of the country, because there are few trees, and therefore exposure is a serious military problem because there is a very few cover. But even in there, things are definitely not easy, especially in terms, again, it's much colder. Also, the area was just poorer with much less proper communications. The road system in Finland was a nightmare for that matter. So something completely different, by the way, from what, because you see the Soviets were looking at what the Nazis were doing, and the Nazis could operate blitzkrieg in European countries that had all kind of paved roads, could move swiftly, from a city to another, taking over industrial complexes and so on. Finland was completely something else. Now, of all the areas where fighting occurred, only the Karelian Isthmus in the south, so between the Baltic and Lake Ladoga, had important farming areas, right, with roads and towns, right. Even in there, something still relatively small, but important for Finland resistance capabilities. For the rest, of the country, there were just few settlements and trails, right, to make, say, what the Soviets were trying to do is essentially a modern warfare working, and having, as we'll see now, already many problems with their doctrine and properly the quality, especially of their staff there. And because of the lack of roads through the lake and swamp topography, the use of heavy mechanized equipment, in fact, was paradoxically more of an hindrance than an advantage, right? Again, the Russians were thinking to go there, making very direct use of their mass and firepower, but paradoxically, their equipment was unsuited to that. Even if it was superior to the Finnish one, still it didn't work. The very cold winter climate, so we're talking about something on average like minus 23 degrees Celsius, and deep snow, sometimes over 30 inches, interfered with everything. Use of vehicles, but even horses. I mean, even the Germans actually invaded the Soviet Union on donkey's back, right? I don't think that the mechanization of warfare at that time had, just everybody was in a vehicle. It didn't work like that. Thus, the advantage laid with the side whose troops were trained and equipped for that specific scenario, chiefly for winter, and who were made mobile in this environment. Think about skiing, that the defense mastered tactically differently from the Soviets that were not used to that. Sometimes properly the sports in peacetime could give some interesting reserves of experience and skill. And so a heavier army would have been essentially bogged down by the same material they were bringing. So let's look at Finnish forces. So speaking of manpower, the Finnish regular armed forces totaled less than 30,000 men. But after 1939, there had been a mobilization for which around 300,000 Finns were under arms, including the paramilitary civic guard, the Suojelaskunta, and also the women auxiliary, Lottasvard. The Soviets there made a lot of misinformation because, of course, there were totalitarianism, but it's important because for many years before the end of the Soviet Union, we literally, historiographically, we literally didn't know, because the Soviets kind of put a blanket over this war that was something devastating. Today we know much more, including, as we'll see now, the perplexities that the same Soviet commanders had. In fact, this was more like Stalin's being pushed by his political advisors rather than a sound strategic assessment in the first place. And the Soviets claimed that only about 200,000 of these men were actual combat troops, including 12,000 foreign volunteers. The Soviet came to, at some point, they had to explain, because of course the sheer amount of losses they suffered in the range of the hundreds of thousands eventually poured into the Union as a note. So that they had to invent the word, like, I don't know, that the Americans had sent 1,000 of their best pilots, or things like they had to make defense something more evenly externally backed, let's say, than its capabilities that were very limited, as a matter of fact. Now, Finnish officers and NCOs were well trained and full of initiative. This was crucial, right, in the command chain. Many of the officers were from the aristocracy, so this also had made them tend to be anti-Russian. In general, the fact that this was formerly part of the Tsarist Empire, right, up to a few generations before. So think about Mannerheim, that now we will look at. Even during the war, a high casualty rate among the small body of regulars that we're seeing before was a major reason for the Finnish termination of the war, because these men were fundamental, and they achieved something extraordinary. So just by their loss, much more was lost. So as we were saying, historically, Finland was a province of the Russian Empire until formally until 1918. Right, at this point, Baron Mannerheim, there was essentially a Swedish Finn, and a Russian general. Was a Tsarist cavalry officer and also spy and explorer. He went in Siberia. It made a lot of interesting, so a very interesting figure. Led successfully a fight for independence, so much that it became effectively the Finnish head of state. And Finland, under his supervision, had developed a small regular force with about 5,000 professionals. The rest were conscripts, as we've seen. So this helped, though, early on to, so in the interwar period, to develop a large trained reserve by default, because the Finns knew that were essentially David against Goliath, and so if they wanted to have any chance of survival in case of Russian attack, they would have had to mobilize basically everything they had. The Finnish organization, in fact, was also given that this limit in resources didn't even change much over the years before the war from its original organization. Basically, they had 3 infantry divisions, a light infantry Jäger brigade, and a cavalry brigade. Other units included some field artillery, coastal artillery, and a few old Renault tanks. A strength was less than 70 aircraft. So during the 1939 crisis, Finland planned to mobilize 15 infantry division. The main problem being that they didn't have the equipment for them, right? They had the people, they didn't have the material. So the equipment was available for only 8 at that point. Later on, they managed to put together 12 divisions. Essentially, also, however, by renumbering and merging, other than, let's say, other by the pre-existing one in the confusion that followed during the war, and that complicates rather the at least the formal order of battle analysis. But we should go much in depth for that. We could make a video about that. So it's arguably not even that important to focus on this aspect because the organization was modified, and especially to fit the available equipment, because again, Finland didn't have probably much in terms of material, so they had, first of all, a desperate need of means. In addition, there were lots of other units, of smaller units that were created, sometimes independent battalions, an unknown number of companies organized to operate along the front, right? So some very small units, but still that were important in the, especially considering sometimes the very few communication routes that existed, and the difficulties in general for the Soviets to advance in this territory and so on. So much of the Finnish defense naturally was pivoting around specific operational areas that were loaded with strategic significance. For example, on the Karelian Isthmus, that is a terrible ground for an invader, for that matter, divisions were grouped into corps, in turn under the command of the Isthmus Army, and another corps operated north of Lake Ladoga. Further north, there were some regional operational commands, so directing those smaller units, melange that we were talking about before, regiments, battalions, and companies. Speaking briefly of Finnish equipment, we have to stress, as we already did, the essentially the major equipment problem that Finland was facing. This consisted properly in a general lack of all kinds of equipment, and also the heterogeneity of the ones provided by the foreign countries. Now, small arms included rifles such as the M2830 and the M39 that were patterned after the standard Soviet bolt-action model. Then there were Luga and Lati L35 automatic pistols, especially the Suomi M31 submachine gun, heavier weapons consisted of the Lattice Laurentum 26 light machine gun, 3 models of Maxim type heavy machine guns, and 81mm mortars. Artillery was mainly the 77mm field gun, supplemented by the 122mm field howitzer. Other calibers were found in the heavy artillery, but that wasn't a lot, really. And most reserve units were kept primarily with rifles, right? Also, there was a dramatic shortage of anti-tank guns. There was a variety of foreign weapons, but they arrived mostly too late or in too fewer number, or let's say sometimes even being, useless for our technical reasons. For example, France sent something like 400,000 rifles, but with only 50 rounds for each. Also, the 148 M model 1877 Debange artillery pieces, which were, pretty bad stuff for those times already, and the Finns would compensate for this by capturing about as many weapons as they got from friendly countries to the enemy, with the added advantage that most, in fact, of the Soviet ones were the same caliber as the Finnish weapons. So that paradoxically, by the end of the war, Finland had about twice the number of weapons, from rifles to tanks, than she had at the start, because of the sheer amount of material that the Soviets lost to them. There was, so broadly speaking, this general advantage of Finnish soldiers being much better habituated to the harsh winter climate. Much more than the Soviets that altogether didn't even match, right? The Finnish knew properly how to dress for it, right? They knew how to wear especially lighter clothes that still would keep them warm, and that wouldn't be an hindrance in movement, right? Also, white camouflage uniforms that the Soviets didn't quite have. It's important to reference about the Mannerheim Line. So this basically stretch across the Karelian Isthmus, and so as we were saying before, the area is filled with rivers, lakes, all this kind of marshy areas that would add naturally to the defense line. That was actually just a series of obstruction trenches, right, and 119 reinforced bunkers. So nothing dramatically impressive. The Soviets claimed that the Mannerheim Line was stronger than the Maginot Line, right, and other amenities that, however, were to be propagandized to cover the sheer scale of losses that were suffered against these fortifications. And speaking of the Soviet army here, we lack historically a substantial amount of information about the Winter War because of the Soviet cover-up of the same. Except for the accounts on breaking the Mannerheim Line at the end of the war, that was kind of the only success eventually brought to the peace negotiations. So the Soviets could field something like 60 more the number of Finnish forces, right? But not all the Red Army was involved in the campaign, albeit it was a major operation that at some point basically involved the wide majority of it at different stages, by the way, because it increased gradually. Because the Soviets were already at that time involved in occupying eastern Poland, they were worried about the broader Western boundaries altogether, from the Baltic states to the Romanian frontier, and also with the Japanese border, because that initially the Soviets could employ only 400,000 of the 1,200,000 men that were the Red Army altogether. So the quality here is important, because Stalin's purges, literally in the previous years, so at the worst time, as you know, were a disaster. This thing had literally taken out more than half of the officer corps, and had replaced them with essentially inexperienced officers of the lower rank, that were chosen essentially just because of political fidelity to the regime. For example, regimental commanders were typically mayors, right? So they knew essentially how to command a battalion better than, and they enlisted were not well trained at all. There was practically no specific specialization in Soviet training for the kind of challenge they would find in Finland. Especially for breaching fortified lines, winter fighting, and in fact anything else at that point. The Soviet officers were largely unqualified. And at the beginning, the Soviet Union employed, in fact, something like 400,000 men, to gradually escalate at some point, and the total numbers would be 900,000 men. So you know that the Red Army had originated during the 1917 revolution, and the following civil war was composed mostly of factory workers, so the so-called proletariat, partisans, also ex-Tsarist officers and soldiers, because that was the deal of Stalin's purges, because many whites, after all, had been reintegrated in the Red Army towards the end, when they were losing the war, etc. So these were competent men. They had fought during World War I. They were part of the Russian army that, at the time had an important historical military culture. And so, taking these away, the quality of the Soviet army literally collapsed, right? It's difficult to make an estimate, but we're talking about, like, if we could measure it, maybe even just a half of its actual expected average, let's say, considering the world average on paper, what an army should be functional like, would be essentially taken away from the Red One. So of course the Soviets, as you have seen here, had one of the largest armies in the world, right? It was pressed to adequately equip such a large force that was very difficult in a country where misery was practically astonishing in any kind of, even officers basically barely ate anything. So naturally much of the Soviet socio-economical substandards were due to the military industrial effort exactly to serve this group, but the consequences in morale and in any other kind of structural quality and training and military culture and were appallingly low. And this naturally was part of the materialistic Bolshevik delusion that it's not about how you motivate an individual to be an individual, but essentially just how much you can use them as just cannon fodder and how much guns you give them. And the Finnish experience would school them literally in the ABCs of reality. That is not even just a matter of warfare anymore. So the Red, so in fact, much of properly of the previous success had been connected to the former Tsarist officers and generals that at this point were taken out. So the Red Army was surely on a large scale innovative, because the just think about their armored and airborne forces outnumbered those in the rest of the world together, right? Even technically, the quality was not the hallmark of Soviet armored forces, but still, mass also does something. And by 1939, much of the equipment was, however, becoming obsolete, right? But this couldn't be done quickly. So we're talking about literally old rifles, tanks, much else was becoming outdated already by the war, right? No country in the world was prepared to World War II. Basically, all armies' performances were kind of poor, right? You think that the Nazis achieved whatever, but they did just in relative terms, because basically most of all the other armies sucked in a way or another. But not even the Germans were at all prepared to World War II, for that matter. The full optimization came by 1942, when they had already lost the war. This is true for many other countries, and that was already after 3 years of dramatic military pressure. So we would have talked about the end of the 40s if the war had not broke out to be minimally prepared. In any case, the Soviet situation was probably, at least the worst in all the major players of the conflict. So speaking of Soviet organization, the basic unit of the Red Army was the Rifle Division, which was named after the high-quality rifle units of the Tsarist army, paradoxically, as distinguished properly from the infantry. Right, this is an important thing, and Russia had at that point had placed a lot of emphasis on this, and in spite of the horrifying disaster in the war, of course, these men proved to be valiant fighters. They fought to the death. It's just that courage is, to be honest, in relative terms, one of the cheapest quality, and that you can have in war, and you don't really win wars because of that. And again, all these men that were an enormous loss for the same. All the sheer losses that the Soviet Union suffered during the Operation Barbarossa were in great part also properly the consequence of not just the Stalinist purges, but also throwing away literally hundreds of thousands of people's lives for practically out of sheer incompetence. So these divisions were all organized all basically in the same way, except that some regular ones had tank battalions or companies attached. As we will see, the combined arms capacity was, even here, very poor. The strength in men and equipment was markedly superior to that one of the Finnish divisions, except they were, as we've seen, overly equipped, and so burdened as a consequence for the primitive Finnish theater of operation. The Leningrad military district was originally responsible for the conduct of the campaign, but when the Red Army got bogged down in Finland and more troops were needed, two other front army groups headquarters were organized, and supervising essentially several armies at a time in a particular area. The Soviet equipment altogether was potentially valuable both in quantity and diversity, right, in spite of the quality. But for this reason, it also imposed a severe strain on the logistical system. Small arms were essentially the famed Mosin-Nagant model 1891 30-bolt action rifle. There was rather mediocre, like the Simonov model 1936 semi-automatic, and the Tokarev model 1938 automatic rifles, right? And these were eventually supplemented by other, Nagant, Tokarev, pistols, the use of submachine guns that would turn useful in Finland, the M34-38, the M40, in fact, that increased considerably during the war because they were quite handy in the forests in close combat. Heavy weapons were similar to the Finnish ones in models, with the addition of the 120 millimeters, or sometimes were also the older 107 millimeters regimental mortar that, as we've seen, the Finns had the 81. Artillery was traditionally the best Soviet arm, and so this would be actually unsatisfactory at the beginning because there was a great deal of shelling that didn't quite bring much of an effect against the Finnish combined arms, but it would prove successful in the latter phase of the war against the Mannerheim Line, when the Soviets, however, still attacked en masse and had actually spent a good 1 month and a half to perfect properly combined arms operations. And another important area of Soviet superiority over the Finns was armor, of course. So, as you will see, the Soviets didn't make a very good use of their tanks. That was also objectively rendered much more difficult in the Finnish theater in the first place. But again, as we were saying before, the ground is not decisive. It was the sheer weight of numbers that gave the Soviets, just because of their armor, a significant advantage. It was their use that rather wasn't very considerate. So the older armor models were, difficulty, especially in the woods, on the snow. However, the new KV was good, and actually more than that, was a success. So this is something that the Nazis overlooked eventually when they also invaded kind of the same areas in the North Front. The Soviets kind of harassed them with this wooded terrain thanks to the KVs. And the another problem was the Soviet troops' heavy clothing. The Soviets had warm clothing. It was not bad for Finnish weather in general, and for much different from Finnish standard, but it was much heavier, right? So this, together with the lack of white camouflage, was a big problem. Another issue was probably the lack of communication equipment, especially radios. So this would render coordination in the attacks ever more difficult. And most Soviet units also had practically no skis. And so this would bring, actually, towards the end of the war, to the creation of some ski units, but their tactical performance was scarce because it was just improvised in a way. So speaking of tactics specifically, the whole point, let's say, of the Finnish-Soviet war is how effectively the Finns managed to essentially employ their poor means at their best. First of all, the most important element here was morale, right? Moral forces are the single most important thing in war, above anything else, right? This is true, of course, in relative terms, but they are the thing that makes the thing moving in the first place. For the rest, the Finnish soldiers were well-trained marksmen. They knew how to move cross-country and fight as small but coordinated units. They had a very good intelligence and security systems. And thus, the small Finnish units were able to spot, outmaneuver, and effectively engage large Soviet formations. they would, considering that the very poor communications, it was ambushes, sabotaging, reconnaissance, etc., were very effective from the Finnish side who knew their land, and they essentially operated by cutting off the Soviet line of communication. So to separate the road-bound, supply-starved columns into pockets by blockading classically the beginning and the end of the column, and to eventually attacking along the various section, the exposed section in different sides. So these pockets were called very famously mottis. We were talking about the motti maybe in another video specifically, because it's very interesting. And they would destroy the enemy units piecemeal. This confused dramatically Soviets, because they were literally in this terrible environment with lack of communication, visibility, intense weather, they would be paralyzed, right? And the Finns could use their concentration of forces locally to take out much larger forces one by one after the other. With the Soviets knowing that, by the way, so making them freak out in the process. So the Finns also were very good at logistics. They supplied vehicles and filled kitchens in order to weaken the enemy through cold and hunger instead from the other side. And by moving quickly, firing from concealed positions, and rapidly eliminating any Soviet patrol that could, be the antennae, the eyes and ears of the army, they could strike fear, right, by reducing sensibly, properly the enemy's ability to react. Because you don't know what's ahead. They know they're waiting for you. You send patrols, they don't come back. That's a very bad sign in the first place, and you don't want to enter into a trap at every step. So this slows the whole thing down. There is an important advantage. It's probably not overlooked, but still an important thing. That is, early in the war, the Finns had obtained the Soviet tactical codes through corps level, and so eventually this also the Air and Navy, the Air Force and Navy codes. Thus, the Finns could already know like where the Soviet Unions were, what they were planning, at least often, and so this intelligence was incredibly valuable in many occasions. So to virtually increase the size of the Finnish divisions that were not there. So the Red Army in this was very different again. So as we have already seen, the lack of effective officers would bring to poorly trained troops, to bad tactical decisions. There was a very little coordination between the various arms. So attacks were often uncoordinated and conducted inefficiently. The lack of communications equipment also, as we've seen, brought to slowing down and the bogging down of the whole machine. And therefore, sometimes the only way to break through was to recur to mass, right? Brute strength that, however, in this scenario didn't really pay much for, because the Soviets would just send these waves of troops, attack, hoping to break. But the Finns had deployed very careful their machine gun nests and bunkers, and this would essentially cause a massacre in the concentrated Soviet formations that would essentially bring to scare the rest of the units. And conversely, the Soviets didn't have many options sometimes, because by outstretching instead the lines, they would essentially at that point be at ever more disadvantage, because the lower they the quantity advantage was, and still one approaching the 1 versus 1, the Finn had a dramatic edge in that scenario, and especially in this advance into territory. At some point, the Soviets were probably, especially in the north, were thrown out at some point. They had to come back to the previous positions before the attack. Also, tank attacks were not coordinated with the infantry, and this was also one of the reasons why so many tanks were lost, because it's not just the infantry which is sheltered by the tank, but also the other way around. There were instances in which essentially, as we've seen, the Finns lacked anti-armor weapons. They often recurred to very primitive but yet effective means, such as Molotov cocktails, etc. And it happened that the tanks would literally, sometimes the Soviet tanks would pass through the Finnish lines, the foxholes, etc. The Finns remaining down, essentially not even showing up. Then the Soviet infantry arriving just second and being essentially massacred without tank support by the Finnish defense, and eventually the tanks remaining essentially isolated behind enemy lines, cut down individually, and thus bring to all failure of the operation. This thing is fascinating, because also the Soviets kind of kept fighting to the death in many occasions. So but that is a pretty good example of how, if there is not a collective training or quality coordination, the individual is useless. So artillery field area barrages, also in the Finnish landscape, mostly wasted most of the ammo rather than making any significant damage. So gradually the Red Army learned how to improve the situation. Things didn't really change much, right? The only option remained the mass attacks, but it was at least a better coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery, plus the addition of some mobile reserves to exploit breakthrough, which could at least capitalize upon the random success that could be obtained along the line. At the small unit level, also special assault groups were organized to efficiently destroy the Finnish bunkers, that, as we've seen, were not many, but were well placed, and they, especially along the Mannerheim Line, were important obstacles when well integrated in the nature there. So to briefly summarize how the war went operationally, we will make other videos about this, by the way. The Soviet Union famously created the frontier incident of Mainila. Essentially, they shelled this village, and they said they had been responding to Finnish fire. Said, those who went visiting the place understood clearly that it had been the Soviets, so they simply moved in. This was on November 30, 1939. And the Soviets were overconfident. They thought that it would have been an easy war, right? It was a small country, they were the Red Army, and it was nothing, right? Their troops were warned not to cross into Sweden. By the way, starting with about 26 divisions, half deployed properly on the Karelian Isthmus, they outnumbered the Finns 3-1, which, as you know, in all military manuals is the ideally, at least, the condition of necessary superiority to pin down the enemy and to outflank him. And by mid-December, their penetrations had already stalled, right? Except for those on the Isthmus and near Petsamo, in the far north. They were being literally chopped up by the Finnish army, The Petsamo area was organized to repel a possible Anglo-French amphibious attack that could take place at some point. Also in eastern Karelia, as we were saying before, the surviving units literally were obliged to retreat towards the border when they kind of reorganized. The Isthmus forces also were reinforced and retrained because they had properly being bogged down and already began to suffer an appalling amount of losses. So there was an increase of the armies, especially in the east. The objective there was especially to properly outflank the Finnish front. But this operation remained stagnant because essentially of the winter in the first place up there is terrifying, and especially the road network that is just a bunch of paths and nothing, and that's the only ones you can follow, by the way, because it's practically there is the polar night there. You don't see anything. There is really nothing else out there. It's already a big deal if you don't freeze to death. In the whole situation, and that's it. So the part-time was employed to kind of toughen up the troops in some ways, but there were a few it could be done, and the Finns knew in that sense exactly where to await for them. So that's where, of course, the south was, of course, had always been the most important theater, so that the Soviets doubled their strength against the Mannerheim Line to break into the heart of Finnish power in industries. By the way, as you know, during World War II, like during the Winter War, the Continuation War, Helsinki and other major Finnish cities were heavily bombarded to cripple the Finnish war effort. Also on the Mannerheim Line, as we've seen, the Soviets introduced heavy artillery, also new model tanks, so that they finally managed to break through, pushing towards Viipuri by concentrating several reinforced divisions against a single Finnish one, right? So the Soviets could advance across rivers, lakes, even the Gulf of Finland with little effort. After that, they passed through the fortifications. The Finns brought in two new divisions to hold the line, but given that their original defenders had lost 2/3 of their men, there was really not much they could do. So the main problem there was that nobody really was helping Finland, right? There was no extensive foreign aid, if anything, because it could not arrive in time, right? So Finland eventually signed a peace treaty with the Soviet Union on March the 12th, 1940. There was even a proposal from Britain and France that were already engaged against Germany, but they proposed to send an expeditionary force to Norway and Sweden, or land at Petsamo in the north. And actually, this is interesting because Finland received help both from the English, the French, etc., but also by Italy, for example, by Hungary, right? So this was still the realization that both the Axis and the plutocratic forces, let's call it in this way, were interested in opposing still the Soviet threat altogether, and had witnessed the Finns, the Finnish resistance as nothing short out of extraordinary. But the British-French effort was, however, also aimed at cutting off Hitler's iron ore supplies from Kiruna in Sweden. So with 4 divisions available, they could have hardly, however, forced the Soviet defenses of Petsamo or taken on the Swedish army for that matter that had remained out. But they kept insisting. Norway and Sweden refused any passage to the Western Allies because they, simply they would have brought otherwise World War II in all Scandinavia at that point. So gradually, those forces that the Western Allies were, were keeping ready for that operation were gradually committed elsewhere as the war also began to break out in a larger fashion in the continent. And definitely, if that aid had arrived, it could have helped the Lapland operations, right? But it again would have probably made the thing escalate much greater in the world region. Would have been an interesting development. In any case, the Finns had essentially, speaking of the losses that are appalling, right? The Finns had essentially 26,000 among dead or missing, 43,000 wounded, something around 900 captured, and 20 to 30 tanks and 62 aircraft destroyed. And then the outcome of the war, essentially, there were some concessions to the Soviet Union, etc. But these things would be retaken during the continuation of war, etc. So Finland remained independent after the war. But speaking of the Soviet losses, so estimates can remain moderate, just saying 150,000 among dead or missing, 195,000 among wounded and sick, a lot, at least more than 60,000 because of sick properly or frostbitten altogether. More than 5,000 captured, and something like half of the Soviet tanks destroyed. Something like between, let's say, around 2,000 tanks, and also an impressive amount of aircraft, around 300, right? But the estimates are still very debated because there is a few information after all, but they sensibly swing less, but also more, and altogether they are incredible losses, right? Naturally, the Soviets claimed that the Finns had lost 60,000 men, which was not true. The Soviet government said at the time they had lost only 50,000 men, very precisely 48,745. As we have seen, they were at least triple, which was already a disgrace, by the way. In the Soviet Union, this war was felt, right? There's the sorrow, I think, day and the celebrations, all they think, because basically everybody had witnessed these losses in the families and everywhere. And in any case, the Finns lost, as we've seen, something between